I simply can't say enough about John Gottman. Gottman was one of the most influential psychologists of the past century. And no surprise there. I think his idea was pure genius. See, rather than looking for what was going wrong in failed marriages and trying to fix that, he was looking for what was going right in great marriages and trying to promote that. So to put this into some context, we have to think about what he had to go through to make this happen. So first he had to get approval and funding for his research project, which was his laboratory. I guess his lab was an apartment on the campus of the University of Washington in Seattle. So he had to get approval for all of that. And I'm sure it was pretty expensive to rig it all with cameras and one-way mirrors and even sensors in the furniture, which he referred to as gigolometers, to measure how fidgety people were when they were sitting on a piece of furniture. Each participant was also outfitted with a heart rate monitor, respiration monitors, to measure what he called DPA, or flooding, or diffuse physiological arousal is the technical term. They took blood and saliva samples and urine samples, all collected for the purpose of having some real hard data regarding stress. He simply wasn't going to rely on any self-report or just observation. And as he pointed out, often the person who appeared to be more calm was actually more physiologically aroused. And interpersonal stress in a relationship is one of the most reliable predictors for failure of that relationship. Now, next, he had to collect data for at least a decade before he could make any determinations about anything, because you simply can't say anything about the data you're looking at until you have the longitudinal outcomes. If you're going to find out what makes a marriage great, you're going to have to make sure that marriage is still great, right? And then go back and look at the data. I absolutely love Gottman's candid stories about finally being able to dig into that data. Because at first, there was major disappointment and even fear that maybe this had all been in vain. Because they expected they would find in their master couples that there would be less arguing, for example. But that just wasn't the case. Master couples argued just as much statistically as the couples who were divorced. Disaster couples, I'll call them. As a matter of fact, some of the couples who had since divorced, the disaster couples, hardly argued at all. And when they looked at things like active listening skills, another big surprise. When master couples were having disagreements or arguing, they rarely used anything close to active listening skills. They yelled and cussed and defended and blamed. They cut each other off and even stonewalled or just ended the conversation. As often as that happened with disaster couples, statistically speaking. Now, I can just imagine Gottman and his crew getting that sinking feeling that, oh my God, we've wasted 10 years of our lives. But being the true scientists that they were, they just kept going back to the data. And that is when the differences started to emerge. Now, you see, it wasn't what was happening when these couples were engaged in conflict. The difference was in what was happening when they weren't. And what was happening when they weren't in conflict was simply amazing. Master couples were making what Gottman dubbed bids for connection. And they were making them 500% more often than the disaster couples. For a more in-depth look at what these bids are all about, I encourage you to take a look at his book, The Relationship Cure. He goes into great detail about bids in that book. So not only were these bids being launched at an incredibly prolific clip, but they were also being accepted by their partner. And it was happening both directions. Bids being launched and bids being accepted. Hundreds of them an hour or more. Now, Gottman used the term positivity as just this general construct that includes all of these bids for connection. And negativity, obviously, is simply the opposite, where few bids are being launched and even fewer being accepted. In place of those bids were things like criticism, blame, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling in those disaster couples. Now, interestingly enough, Gottman was able to pinpoint the ratio of positive to negative that had to exist for the relationship to flourish, to be master couples. And you want to guess what that minimum was? Well, I'll give you a second to guess. Yep, here it is, 5 to 1. 5 positives to 1 negative. That was the ratio. That was the minimum, the bottom threshold. And as they logged the data, they saw that ratios often zoomed as high as the hundreds, like 100 to 1. Now, here's a quote from Gottman. He says, "What can make a marriage work is surprisingly simple. Happily married couples are not smarter or richer or more psychologically astute than others, but in their day-to-day lives, they have hit upon a dynamic that keeps their negative thoughts and feelings about each other, which all couples, of course, have, from overwhelming the positive ones." This is it, that 5 to 1 ratio or higher. Rather than creating a climate of disagreement and resistance, they then embrace each other's needs. And when addressing a partner's request, their motto tends to be helpful, yes, and, rather than yes, but. And this positive attitude not only allows them to maintain, but also to continue to increase their sense of romance and play and fun and adventure and learning together that are at the very heart of any long-lasting love affair. They have what Gottman calls an emotionally intelligent marriage. That's what this is all about. So, these couples were busy putting money, if you will, in their emotional bank accounts. What they'd learned is that these positive bids were so valuable, like money in the emotional bank. And they were building these accounts as far into the black as they possibly could. And then, when conflict occurred, which it always does in the master or disaster couples, there was enough of a buffer to keep the relationship well in the black, not even close to dipping into the red. Now, by way of contrast, those disaster couples, they're frequently running in the red. Some of them never made it out of the red. Their relationships were emotionally bankrupt. Now, let's go back to that 5 to 1 ratio and take another look. Not 4 to 1, not 3 to 1, not 2 to 1. And this is super significant because couples that are running at, say, 4 to 1 might feel that they have an adequate level of positivity. But no, they're simply not protected enough. 4 to 1, 4 times as much positivity as negativity simply wasn't enough. And when I wrapped my head around this principle, Man, that really hit home for me. That was my aha moment. That's when the light bulb went on for me, and it stayed on for 24 years and counting. You see, I was introduced to Gottman's work the same year I was married for the second time, my second marriage, which I believe is absolutely a master marriage. My first marriage, by way of contrast, was a complete disaster. I was one of those disaster couples. I just didn't get it. And honestly, I was one of those guys who would have said, we didn't fight that much. And when we did, I thought we made up for it. Looking back, I was probably running at 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1 at best, but I was clearly in the red a lot. So I took Gottman's advice in my second marriage, the marriage I'm in now, and the one I've been in for 24 years. And at 24 years into this marriage, I actually celebrate my 24th anniversary this month. I have to tell you, I am a happy, happy guy. And I am masterfully married to my best friend. And if I had to pick one principle of Gottman's, and he's got 7, perhaps more if you really want to divvy it out, I have to say respecting this 5-to-1 ratio stands at the very top. I still make a lot of mistakes in my marriage, and I make a lot of mistakes probably with all the other principles as well. But the one mistake I will never, ever make is to let this ratio dip below 5-to-1. I shoot for 10-to-1 or better just to be safe. And I tell couples all the time, if you hear nothing else, hear this. This is the holy grail of mastering marriage. So I support all of Gottman's principles, and I support him in my practice as well as in my own life. As far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely nothing better out there. It's the only approach that I use, and it's the only approach I teach. I use it exclusively. It is the best by far.